All right, we'll call the meeting of the Wasa Policing Task Force to order. We have all members present. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the December 21st meeting. What are your wishes? Are there any additions, corrections? Sorry, motion to approve?
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Who made the motion? Was it Mike? Or Pat? Pat moved and Will seconded. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? That motion carries with one distinct yes vote. Next, we're going to do a discussion of possible action and develop task force recommendations. You have in your packet a cryptic summary of issues that have come before us in the past, as well as actions that we've taken in the past. And there's a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet in the packet that deals with recommendations passed by the committee. I'd like to just take a few minutes to make sure that we captured the intent of the task force on those issues, and then we'll go on to other issues. But in the packet, it again looks like the spreadsheet. It's a couple of pages into it. On officer wellness and training, we wanted to invest in more specific EAP programs with adequate training for mental health support for officers, which passed unanimously at our November meeting. Then we had one, provide funding for on-call interpretive services, proactively letting the public know that this is available rather than putting the burden on friends and business people, not in the interpreter business, to help when they are needed. I'm not sure if that falls under officer wellness and training or not, but that's where we put it. And then I think it's still compressed. Do you have access to her file? On this, we were trying to get.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking at
Excel?
this, the Excel spreadsheet. I'll look.
No, I only have what she sent
Okay.
in the packet.
I apologize, but the third item was recommend the city amend its health plan to enhance mental health benefits for members of the Wausau Police Department. The next item was to recommend that the city continue to expand and invest resources to improve officers' mental health training. So those were the issues relative to officer health, wellness, and in training, with the dates that the action was taken. In terms of mental health services, we had a motion to expand CART to 24. Well, we were looking at trying to get the 3 to midnight and weekends covered in that motion. Homeless outreach services be continued in the police department, but transition to a social worker. And request North Central Healthcare continue to pursue strategies for community-based management services, a case manager. And then the final recommendation was recommend Officer Lemeron present on his experiences on transportation services to the Metro Ride, with the hope of trying to expand those services. That's what I pulled out of our minutes. Any questions? Does anybody want to revisit any of those issues? Clarify, expand? I think we can do some of that expansion in the preparing of the report, but this was action that we took to date. There were then a number of issues. There were a couple of issues that we had held over looking for clarification and expansion on. One was to conduct a public service campaign about interacting with law enforcement to achieve positive outcomes, especially with the younger generations. Discussion to include other subsets of the population, or whether we should be more general. So that was one of the issues that we carried over from the last meeting, looking for clarification. Maybe we can start there with a discussion about where to go, or what you specifically would like to see in that area. Any thoughts? I think this was one of those, trying to get at, the public has expectations of the police department, and are there any expectations that we would have for citizens, and how would we go about communicating that? And is there a need for us to take action on that? I guess the options are to clarify or to move on. Any thoughts? Any thoughts? If not, we'll perhaps come back to that later. And then the other needing clarification, social media, need for a communication policy to address all segments of society to get cultural and to get, I think it's poorly worded, but this was out of the notes. To get, culture, to make sure that all cultures and races are included, recommended the police department continue their efforts with social media, interact in a positive way. So I think that recommendation was, I think, aimed at making sure that we had a communication policy that acknowledged and addressed all segments of our society and with racial, cultural, and other differences, and that the police department continue to their efforts on social media and engage in a positive manner. Mike, I see you nodding. I'm not hearing you. Mike Kemp North.
No, I was dealing with the child issue. Sorry about that.
Okay. Any thoughts?
I guess I do have one. I think I'm a little concerned about when we're talking about a communication policy out of respect to the multicultural essence of this, to focus just on social media. I wonder if we need to be more broad in a communication policy that, we're making some assumptions. Yes, I would think continuing with social media is important, but when I think about the community, I don't know if social media is the only route that further communication should be developed and pursued.
Perhaps adding the word multimedia approach to communications would incorporate the press, TV, radio, newspapers, and social media. Would that address that concern?
Yeah, I think something of that nature. Conceptually, I don't want us to be restrictive in our recommendation and then alienate a population or a group of people that we might truly wanting to connect with.
And that your observation would be consistent with what we found when we did the WIP survey on how people find out information, so. Any thoughts on that issue? We would need a motion to advance the recommendation if that's your desire.
I guess I will make a motion to that end. Make a motion that we move forward, that we take a multimedia approach in terms of communication policy to address segment society, be it culture and race included, and recommend to the PD to continue their efforts in a wide range of areas to interact in a positive way.
Okay, is there a second?
I second that.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion carries. Then we have a long list of topics that were out there. This is not an all-inclusive list, but it is sort of the list from our committee meeting. Some of these items we have taken action on a few, but I just thought I would throw those out there for the purpose of making sure that the task force looked at those and determine whether or not we want to make any recommendations. And my suggestion is that perhaps today we identify those issues that we want to move, and we've got one more meeting. At that meeting, we prioritize our recommendations to give us a chance to think about what they are and what the overall ranking should be, if that makes sense. So today we would just begin to develop recommendations, try to then prioritize at the next meeting for the final report. Does that make sense to the members?
John?
Go ahead, Pat.
John? Yeah, I'm wondering if that list you're referring to, what page of the packet would we find that on?
It would just be issues and topics. I don't have it in front of me, but I think it might begin on page 3? 4? Page 4? It begins, issues and topics, mental health gaps, case management
Oh, got it. Thank you.
services. And again, this is just one person's effort to look at it. Going from there, so. We can either go through those line by line or just, if you've got some concerns, we can do that. We've talked about case management in North Central Healthcare. We talked about homeless outreach coordinator being a social service provider versus a police officer. We've talked about the importance of having alcohol and other drug abuse services, inpatient resources available as soon as possible through North Central Healthcare. We've talked about the need for transportation support for treatment and medical care for people so that they can make the appointments and not miss them, and that are critical for addressing some of the issues of the populations that we serve. There was a suggestion for wet houses for the homeless so that people with drinking issues have a place to go. We've talked at length about the 5115 crisis delays and the role of law enforcement in that. There's some statutory limitations. We've talked about local medical detox facility and criteria, the concerns over they need to be sick, and whether or not access should be expanded before receiving services. The lack of local medical monitored treatment services, in locally residential services, case management services for voluntary commitments. The concern there is that people voluntarily come in and then they walk away and there's no follow-up, and so should we have some management of those people to ensure better outcomes. Affordable housing for those in need of services was identified. And again, these are consistent with our task of looking at social and other needs in the community, not necessarily all aimed at the police department, but rather issues that affect policing in people's interaction with the police department. We've talked about 24-hour supervision of certain populations and individuals. CART expansion we've taken action on. Additional, there's talk about additional mental health workers at the police department. 5115 changes to address legal challenges, individual rights versus the process, again, restating that. Differentiation between homelessness and crisis. I'm not sure it was just an issue that was put out there in how we deal with those North Central healthcare employees embedded in the police department. How do we ensure that the proper people are responding to a call? That came out of our November meeting.
John,
Go ahead.
if we could go back to that differentiating between homelessness and crisis, unless we've got something specific to implement in that regard, we might just put a line through that and not forward it. I don't know what other-
Yeah, Pat, I'm not anticipating we're going to forward all of these. I'm just, again, these were issues that we talked about. We would need to develop recommendations. And again, the pot of resources is finite, as you well know, as a member of the council. So,
Well, if we're sorting, that's one I put in the out pile.
okay. Anybody object to that? If we'll operate by consensus and then we'll go back and deal with motions. I see nobody objecting. How do we ensure that the proper, what people are responding? We had a discussion of the first concern in response was to determine safety. Once public safety risk is addressed, should we involve a mental health technician in the care? Modify medical assistance to allow better approach to behavioral issue. That would be a recommendation to the legislature. Use of ARPA dollars per Walworth County to support mental health services. Integrate behavioral health with crisis services. Insurance coverage for mental health services, and medical clearance issues relative to presentation. Those were the issues. Some of them are clear, some of them are ambiguous. Are there any issues from this list or other issues that you recall us dealing with that you think should be advanced for recommendation? Any thoughts?
Actually, you said are from other lists. I do want to go back, because I was kind of finding my way through the papers when you went over the issues that needed clarification. We had talked the last time about some sort of way to educate the public in terms of their interactions with law enforcement to create better outcomes. And we had talked about a discussion about how sometimes people may be missing each other in terms of, their preconceived notions and how not even knowing how to interact sometimes when those happen, how that could be an important opportunity. So I do want to make a motion on that first issue that needed clarification. I don't know if we have to say, especially with younger generations, I know through the survey, we had saw that particularly younger generations kind of stood out in terms of their interactions. But I think these are lessons that, in terms of public service campaign, that would be useful for everyone. So I'll make a motion that we conduct a public service campaign about interacting with law enforcement to achieve positive outcomes, period.
Second.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of that motion will signify by saying aye.
John, I think you had Sarah trying to speak.
Oh, Sarah, go ahead. You're muted.
Muted.
Go ahead, Sarah. You're still muted.
Can you type in the chat box?
She's been having problems tonight. She chatted with me earlier, so I don't know, maybe that she still can't get the audio.
Is it now?
Now you're good.
Yay! Okay. Would we be able to add in not what William was saying about, younger generations and that kind of stuff as well? But I also think about our new refugees and them also being educated on, what is happening, like how to interact with our law enforcement here. Because I'm sure there's cultural differences that occur between how they interact with, potential law enforcement there and that kind of thing. So that it's not just, our current population, but also those that are moving into our area.
Well, if I may, Chairman.
Go ahead.
Actually, my motion was to take out, especially with young generations, so that it would be more general, so that we could apply it to more.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear that
Oh,
part.
no, that's all right.
Okay, so with that clarification, so the motion is,
So the motion is to conduct a public service campaign about interacting with law enforcement to achieve positive outcomes, period.
any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no? That motion carries. All right, any other, going back to the mental health, now I'd like to just stay, if we can, on the category, and the categories are mental health gaps, community engagement, cultural awareness, data collection, officer wellness and training, and then we will have a catch-all for others. But if we could sort of try to focus in on areas. Any thoughts in the area of mental health gaps or recommendations? We heard, go ahead.
So I know that we've been talking about CART quite a bit, and my experience with CART has been really great. When we talk about the expansion of it being 24-hour service, if that is something that is not able to be budgeted, would they, because it feels like there is a higher need for those services more in the evenings, would it be a potential to shift that from out of first shift to that more evening shift? If there is not the ability to change, budgeting for it.
I think we've already taken a stand on that at our November meeting. It was suggested that the main hours needed to be 3 to midnight and weekends. That's in our recommendation. For the expansion. All right, anything else? What about, anything relative to crisis services? I think that there have been concerns expressed about medical clearance. There have been concerns about that whole commitment process, what law enforcement role is in it. Do we have any recommendations at this time? Or do you feel like it's beyond us because it's a statutory change? I know we heard about that often. The lack of a motion would indicate to me that we feel like the legislature needs to address it. Is that something that we would want to ask the legislature to do as a recommendation? Request that the legislature look at the issues associated with mental health commitments or crisis placements in terms of its demands on resources on law enforcement? I'm just asking.
Sorry, I know I'm making all the motions tonight, but this was another topic that we spent quite a lot of time on and seemed very passionate about during the course of our time here on the task force. So at the very least, I would like to make a motion that we make a resolution geared toward the legislature on addressing some of these issues in terms of commitments and crisis services.
I can second that.
So is the intent to clarify the role of law enforcement in that area? Go ahead, Katie.
Oh,
From
I
there.
just wanted to offer my support for this. I think this is a place where we actually will find alignment with the folks who represent us, and it's a good opportunity to have these conversations. That's all I have for you.
Okay, any other discussion? Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Any other issues in this area that we want to take a stab at? You know, transportation services, we've encouraged North Central Healthcare to look at case management services already. Any other issues in mental health that you think at this time we should advance? We can come back to it too, should you decide at a later time that we need to. Community engagement. We talked about the expansion of the neighbor-to-neighbor with groups such as the Hmong and the LBGT community. Having community groups give a presentation to the Wasa PD staff. And I just threw in there the role of the school liaison officer because that came up. Are there other issues or any concerns that you have? This would be, I think, Sarah, a good chance if you were concerned about certain populations, about expansion of the neighbor-to-neighbor program to address cultural and ethnic differences, if that was a desire.
Yeah, I would agree.
So are there any motions? This is an area that, my observations relative to particularly sitting in on the listening session that we had with the Hmong community and Hmong leaders, is that there seems to be significant differences of understanding of the roles of law enforcement versus cultural norms. And I think one of the ways you overcome that is through dialogue and a better understanding. Not to say that we would compromise protection of people, particularly in domestic abuse situations, but rather have them have a better understanding of why it's important for us to enforce the laws in those areas. So I see real value in trying to look at an expansion of the neighbor-to-neighbor to deal with some of those cultural differences, and I'm sure we will have some that will present themselves as we get more and more of the Afghanis and others as part of the relocation efforts going forward. So
I will, and again, I'm sorry making all the motions, but again, this was one of those areas that I thought would be very beneficial moving forward, especially with our Hmong population, also to reach out to our LGBTQ population and now our refugees. So I would make the motion to expand our neighbor program with groups like among LGBTQ and our new refugee neighbors.
Is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
All right,
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Anything else under community engagement? Any new topics? If not, we'll move on to cultural awareness. And again, these were little tidbits from my or other people or the committee minutes. Culture isn't just Hmong and Afghani. Culture can also be LGBTQ, identity, gender, and or orientation. And I think we dealt with that relative to community engagement. Look at communication and tools and approaches, suggest that we have maybe I should have put this one in community engagement, suggest that we have a city videographer do a short video to go with our report. I think we can save that for later, that discussion about how we'll roll this out. Social media affects their attitude toward police, police expectations, public expectations survey. I think I probably put many of these in the wrong category, but survey citizens frequently. I'd like to just, we haven't made a specific recommendation, but we've talked repeatedly about doing the community surveys on a regular basis to determine whether or not there are any shifts in tendencies, patterns, or perceptions. Do we want to take a stand on that issue?
in terms of make a stand, are you saying determine the frequency, like every 2 years?
Well, do we want to, first of all, make a recommendation that we continue to practice, and then we can deal with the frequency? So it is both, Pat. So
I would say we should continue the practice and we should do it every 2 years.
is that a motion?
Yes.
I'll second that.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
All right.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Diversity training. It was asked if the Hmong community has a regular meeting with the police, that the police go to on a regular basis, such as the neighborhood groups do. I think we just addressed that in our neighbor-to-neighbor program. Anything relative to cultural awareness that you would like to see us address? Anything? All right, we will move
I think
on.
at some level, we need to have a recommendation. I'm trying to figure out what it looks like. And conceptually, I think as a task force, there needs to be a continued emphasis and encouragement of it. I'm just right now processing what exactly how we would operationalize it in a motion.
Are you talking, Mike, about the practice of police attending a regular meeting?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to be, I'm really trying to keep some of the stuff coming from us, in my opinion, should be broad to allow the people who do this every day the discretion to use recommendations from us in areas they feel would be beneficial. I mean, at some point we're going to be disbanded or whatever, but are we I'd rather lay the basement, the foundation, so that people can build off of it And I guess, so instead of just saying in the Hmong community, I'm trying to like word, so encourage them to be, even if it's the Boys and Girls Club, if it's alternative high schools, if it's, because all of that is sort of engaging and regularly meeting to get learning about diversity and things, the new populations coming into the community. That was all I'm just trying to word out. I'm not as fast probably as William is on motion writing, so I'm sure he's probably got it written, and we'll be set here in about 30 seconds.
I think a possible motion would be that the task force would ask that the police department offer to the Hmong community and other similar groups an opportunity to have a police officer attend their meetings on a regular basis or on a as requested, but to establish a connection with those groups.
I'm sensing that there's a difference between what Pat is saying and what Mike is saying, Mike Kemp North is saying. I think what we're looking for here is to ensure that the police department has ongoing efforts to understand cultural diversity issues in the community. And that's different than sending a representative there where one is, we've got one representative with a group and the other is incorporating those understandings into the training and the procedures and policies. So maybe I'm wrong, but I think we're looking for how do we ensure that the police department going forward has the training relative to those differences and diversity necessary to perform their job.
I was going to say that same thing, and I wasn't sure if anybody was getting ready to make a motion or whatever, so I didn't want to interrupt. But I think in terms of the interactions that we're talking about, I think that kind of goes along with our neighbor to neighbor. This, I do think, is something different in terms of education and awareness. Now, we had talked before about whether or not, in terms of value implicit bias. I don't think we have to say an implicit bias training, but I think we can make the recommendation that the police force engage, each year into some sort of cultural awareness education, in terms of, and they can look at, what's best in terms of, or different approaches to that they may think is effective. But making some commitment toward that. So I will make the motion that the police force, at least yearly, engage in some type of cultural awareness education training for the police force.
Is there a second?
Second that.
Any discussion?
I have a question on it. It's more cultural awareness for the police department rather than having the police department do outreach into these cultural groups.
Well, I think we're doing both because the neighbor to neighbor program, I think, is the outreach, and this is about the education piece.
I have no problem with the motion as it's made. I don't know if it covers, I think maybe another motion might be made in terms of our expectation that the police department do outreach in the community, but
I think
we'll go on that one.
Pat, I think we did that in our previous motion relative to the neighbor to neighbor program expansion.
Very good. Very
So,
good.
Any discussion, other discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Oppose? That motion carries. Anything else under cultural awareness? All right, data collection, and some of this is cryptic notes that I had, but the need for better data collection, date, not date. The university program, That was in there because we had the discussion about that being old data. I think that, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's 10-year-old data that came out in a 5-year-old report that didn't give us a lot of information. And some of these issues go beyond what the police department has, but we had discussions about length of sentence, sentencing, probation, jail, prison, fine. Are there differences relative to socioeconomic status or race? Cash bonds versus signature bonds and what that might do to impact on communities, incarceration rates, and are there any differences in the offering of diversion programs to people of different backgrounds? So those were, is there a desire to do anything relative to data collection? And Mike Kemp North, I would look to you. Is this something that the police department should do, the city should do, or someone else?
So I get worried about this. Data collection costs money. And it takes a group of people and skill sets that aren't necessarily typically employed with or as part of the city. Do I think data is important? You bet. I just get concerned that, to tell the police department or to encourage more data collection in a general statement is really hard. I would think about making a motion to say, encourage, partnerships with, organizations seeking data or seeking research on social justice issues. But to put it all on the city that's not very realistic in my opinion.
So was that in the form of a motion, or are you looking for?
I would say I would move to encourage the city to continue partnerships with organizations for research into social justice issues around the criminal justice system.
I second that.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries.
Does that motion replace anything that's under data collection at the moment?
It sort of encompasses all of those issues. So it doesn't replace anything. Again, those were issues that were raised at some point in our discussion over the last 20 months or whatever it's been, or 18 months. In the university program, the work that David Rundy is doing, who didn't present to us, but some of the issues that I think Chad Billup had raised. And we don't have, I think the concern is we don't have good information on which to make a decision or a recommendation. And I think
What we could say is that with Mike's motion as the lead-off under that section, we'd say data collection would include such things as length of sentence, sentencing, probation, jail, prison, fine, cash bonds, blah, blah, all that stuff. This is what we would like data collected on.
Mike, I would look to you. They can either be did we vote on that?
We did vote.
We did vote, so it would be seeking clarification of that. Mike, was that your intent, or should we have
Sure. I would use as, for example, I don't want, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues out there that I would encourage the city to pursue. If someone came to them and said, look, we want to look at whether it's stops, whether it's, you know,
Yeah.
um, uh, you know, searches of cars, whether it's, you know, I mean, there's lots of opportunities. I think in honor of Pat's ideas, I do think that providing some examples would add clarification and give some direction, but not saying, we give them a direction and some ideas.
So why don't we, for the purposes of this one, we'll, as we're working on the report, have specific, well, maybe we'll put some examples in there, bring that back to you for your review as part of the approval of the final work product. So
Excellent.
we will work on that.
I was just gonna say that, and you know, in terms of another phrasing, just usually in a lot of legalese, we say some examples may include but are not limited to the following. You know, something like that, if that makes it better. But I also don't want to be too specific, because he did say social justice issues, and that can include a lot of different things.
Yep.
It'd be more expansive.
All right, anything else on that? All right, we'll move on to officer training and wellness. Police feel threatened under scrutiny due to Black Lives Matter. That was something that came out of the focus groups. Police have a difficult job, and are they ready to address issues in people? Was something concern is over tit for tat response. We get attitude at the time of the interaction, which tends to change their behavior. Bilingual competencies at hiring. Co-responder does welfare checks. I think the thought there is that do police need to do welfare checks, or if we have the CART team in place, does that person do that welfare check? It should be a peer support services. I think that came out of some of the officers. An ethics board for police officers on a statewide basis. Those were things that came up at some point in time. And again, if the list isn't inclusive enough, or you want something else discussed, now is the time to do it. So any thoughts? And then some of those were statements that were made. I don't know that we can change opinions, but we need to be aware of those as we develop our recommendations. Any thoughts?
Well, I definitely have, and probably know in terms of this motion coming, that we do and I've talked about this, for a resolution to the legislature regarding an ethics board for police officers on a statewide basis.
Is it police or law enforcement?
Law enforcement, I'm sorry.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right,
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And what follows is sort of some cryptic notes. But I wanted to make sure that, we understood that we had 1,231, actually, now it's 1,233. Just two came in late. Dealing with community attitudes, perception of behavior, views on treatment, age differences in results, there were gender differences, race differences. That in the context of the listening session, we had 12 themes: attitude toward police, public policies and laws, social determinants, concerns over specific types of crime, resources, priorities, deployment, community relations, safety, police bias and discrimination, integrity, and there was particularly one, police not following rules like distracted driving, philosophy of police, proper role of police, crime prevention versus response, more empathy than authority from officers, more facilitation, officers' disposition, and officer well-being. Those were themes that came out of the listening sessions according to what WIPs had presented to us. Do those generate any thoughts or needs for action? Any thoughts? All right, are there any other areas that we would like to address? I think
John?
that, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
So just two quick things, back to the last section. I don't know if this really belonged in there, but I believe I said this last meeting. One of the things that stood out to me was I think it could be very helpful and welcoming in our community if our law enforcement officers learned a few basic commands in different languages. I'm not going to make that into a motion. I know the chief's in the room, but I would encourage them to continue to pursue that. I think that could be very helpful and well worth their time. That was impressionable upon me. And then the one thing I do want to make a motion on is throughout this process, I've been just really impressed, really from the get-go, about how progressive our department's been, starting with our leadership and all the way through the department about embracing not only this process, but I remember when we first looked at the President's Task Force report and I asked the chief, what did you do when this report came out? And we sat down as a command staff and we went through and we looked at all the ways that we could address some of these opportunities, and they did that unprompted, unsolicited. And I just want to, I don't know if the recommendation is that the council offers commendation for the police department in some form about being very active and trying to see what they can do, just to thank them for the work that they've done and continue to encourage them to embrace feedback from the public and continue to evolve policing in our community. I think they put Wasa in a pretty good light through this whole process in my mind.
Very well said, sir.
Is that a motion? Because I'll make a second.
I think.
It was a very eloquent, but.
I think I need, for the purposes of being actionable, and I was going to go there next, so Michael, you beat me to that. But, so, I think what we can do is, as a task force, make an observation that the department seems to live its values in terms of character and hire and trait and promote, and we encourage them to continue to honor those values, but something along those lines. But we can work on a statement or a motion between now and the next meeting, if that's your desire.
Perhaps the chair could kind of encapsulate the things that we've said over the months in terms of seeing where other police departments lack and our police department is already on top of an issue. Maybe a brief statement indicating the task forces being impressed with the police department we do have, and acknowledging that nobody's perfect, but we have a very good starting point here in this examination. Would the chair be willing to do that?
I will. I will work on some language that we'll present to you at the next meeting for your review. I think it's important that we all agree to that. So we'll work on something that will capture that thought.
Excellent.
Let me go back
Mr.
to,
Lloyd may even send you a few ideas to include.
I'm sure I'll get those about 5:15 tomorrow morning.
You got it, John.
All right, we can work on that. Other areas, are there some issues that are unresolved that we want to weigh in on? Are there other statements that we'd like to make? Any request of the legislature, of the council? Any voids that we have? So we're now up to, with that last statement, we'll be up to 17 recommendations as a group. We can pull those together and let you look at those and try to prioritize those at the next meeting. If that makes sense, what I would like to do is try to capture those. We'll try to get those out by Friday of this week for you to look at. And then our next meeting would be the 31st. So 2 weeks from yesterday. So I think we can move and rank order them. I think some of the things that we'll need to talk to the mayor about is, one of the things we were supposed to do is have a public meeting or public input on our recommendations. So my hope is that we could develop the final report, take that out, present it to the city, get some feedback, and then make the final presentation to the council and the Police and Fire Commission. But we are still on target for trying to wrap up at the end of the month, if possible. I know a lot of you, well, not all of you have put in considerable time, and we thank you for those efforts. But are there any other issues at this time, and we'll have one more chance to revisit those at the next meeting, on issues that we haven't resolved?
The only other thing is, and we should probably get together, Chair, about figuring out a time to discuss this with the Police and Fire Commission as well, in terms of presentation.
Can you
So-
say that again? Well, I didn't catch what you said.
Yes, I had said the Chair and I we'll get together to discuss a time appropriate to discuss this with the Police and Fire Commission as well, the recommendations and what we've been doing.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I think what we want to do is develop a rollout strategy, if you will, and sort of targeted timeframes for the Police and Fire Commission, for the Public Safety Committee, for the community, and for the council. So we can work on that, and, well, we can work specifically on an approximate range date, but we can work on that and bring that in at the next meeting. Okay, anything, Kayla, anything that you'd like to see us address that we haven't? Anybody? Sarah?
I think we got it all.
Sarah? Mike? Michael? Pat?
I'm good, thanks.
Will?
I think we're good for now.
All right. So we will work on the final report. The mayor and I will be, along with the chief, will be meeting later this week to talk about where we're at and the final report. I did capture the number of dates that we've met on one of those sheets. We've had a lot. What I want to do is go back and pick out the key issue at each of those dates and put that in as an appendix, so that the council and others know how thorough we have been. We could have kept this going, but I think there's a need to wrap it up. And I've learned so much and appreciated the the support that we've gotten from you as task force members and the city, as well as, and in particular, the police department, and our efforts to understand and their efforts to enlighten. I think it's been very helpful to us, so. With that.
Actually, Chair, if I may, just want to make sure that we don't forget anything. And one of the things, obviously, in this process, we talked about how the police force has been in this process. I just want to ask Chief Bliven if there's anything that he thinks that we have missed that he'd also like to see within these recommendations. Okay, says no, so I think then we're good.
All right. Anything else? Ben, I will ask you on Friday when we meet and how you would like us to roll this out to your department as well. So we will deal with police and fire commission and the PD. Anything else? If not, a motion to adjourn would be in order.
I would make that motion.
Moved by Pat, seconded by
Will?
Will. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right,
Opposed, no? Thank you all.
thank you.